6 times in the last 2 years, you've built your savings back up past $3,000. 6 times, it's dropped back to under $500 within weeks. Not from an emergency, not from a layoff, not from anything you couldn't have predicted, from something you bought, usually, right after you'd finally started to feel good about the number. If you pulled up your bank statements right now and marked every point your savings crossed, 3,000, you'd see the same shape repeat itself, almost identically 6 separate times. A climb, a peak, a purchase, a crash back to nearly zero. Then weeks later, the climb starts again, as if some part of you has been waiting for the number to feel real, before quietly deciding it shouldn't. 3 months ago, you had $200 saved. You felt proud. You told a friend about it over coffee, and for a few days, you caught yourself checking the number just to feel that small flicker of pride again. 2 weeks later, you bought a 2400 television you'd been thinking about for months, not because the old one broke. It didn't. It still worked perfectly fine, sitting in the corner of a donation pile you never actually took anywhere. Before that, you'd hit $2,800. Then a spontaneous weekend trip, $600, booked at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, decided in about 4 minutes, with a friend who was as surprised as you were that you actually went through with it. Before that, $3,400 became a laptop you didn't need for freelance work you haven't done in over a year. Before that, a phone upgrade you didn't need for a phone that worked fine. Before that, a home office setup for a home office you use twice a month. Each time in isolation you can explain the purchase. Each time in the moment it made sense. The television really was a good deal. The trip really was a fun memory. The laptop really could theoretically be useful someday. But zoom out, and a pattern emerges that's much harder to explain away with logic about deals and value. The moment your savings crosses a number that starts to feel real, solid, meaningful, like actual security, something in you finds a reason, almost immediately, to bring it back down. This isn't bad luck, and it isn't a lack of discipline, even though it feels exactly like both of those things when you're in the middle of it. Psychologists call this self-sabotage, and in personal finance specifically, it shows up as an unconscious discomfort with financial security itself. For some people, having money saved doesn't feel safe. It feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, to a nervous system that never grew up around financial stability, can register as something close to dangerous. If you grew up in a household where money was tight, or unpredictable, or a constant undercurrent of tension, bills discussed in hushed, stressed voices, a parent's mood shifting with the mail, the quiet anxiety of never quite knowing if there'd be enough, your brain may have learned a specific lesson early, long before you had the vocabulary to question it. Money doesn't stay. Don't get attached to it. Enjoy it while it's here, because it always leaves eventually anyway. So when your savings account starts to prove that old lesson wrong, when the number keeps climbing instead of disappearing the way it always used to in your experience, some part of you steps in to correct it. Not consciously, not maliciously, not even noticeably in the moment. Just quietly, reliably, the way old wiring does what it was built to do, whether or not it's still useful. This shows up in research on financial trauma and scarcity mindset. People who experienced chronic financial instability in childhood often display exactly this pattern in adulthood, even after their income and circumstances have completely changed. The nervous system doesn't automatically update just because the bank account did. It keeps running the old program until something interrupts it deliberately. Here's what 6 sabotage saving cycles actually cost you, in numbers that are easy to skip past, but worth sitting with for a second. If that $3,000 had simply stayed invested at a modest 7% return instead of being spent and rebuilt 6 separate times over 2 years, you'd be sitting on roughly $3,450 today. Not because you saved more in total, but because you let it compound instead of resetting the clock every single time. But that's actually the smaller cost. The bigger one is harder to put a number on. 2 years of momentum you never got to keep. 2 years where you could have been the kind of person whose savings account just quietly grows in the background, unremarkable, boring, uninterrupted, instead of the kind of person who experiences 6 separate emotional cycles of pride, then guilt, then a slightly hollow feeling after each purchase, then quiet determination to start over again. The real cost isn't the $2,400 television or the $2,600 trip. Those things came and went, mostly forgotten now. The real cost is that you've spent 2 years relearning the same lesson over and over. Instead of being 2 years further into a completely different relationship with money. Your coworker Priya grew up with money just as tight as you did. Maybe tighter. Same kind of household tension. Same background of never quite feeling financially settled. Similar starting salary when she began her career. For years. She had the same pattern you're describing now. Savings climbing steadily. Then a purchase that didn't quite make sense in hindsight. Then back to near zero. Then the slow climb starting over. 3 years ago she noticed it. Not through some dramatic realization, but through a fairly ordinary conversation. She mentioned to a friend, almost as a joke, that she seemed to buy something big every time she finally had some money saved. Her friend, who happened to know a bit about behavioral finance, pointed out what was actually happening. Priya didn't believe it at first. It felt too simple, too tidy an explanation for something that had frustrated her for years, but she tried the fix anyway. Mostly because she didn't have a better idea. She didn't try to fix it by promising herself she'd resist the next purchase. She'd tried that a dozen times already, and it never worked for more than a few weeks. Instead, she made her savings invisible. She set up an automatic transfer to a completely different bank, one she doesn't have a debit card for, one that isn't visible on the same app she checks every day out of habit. She stopped watching the number climb. Because watching it climb, she realized, was exactly what was triggering the sabotage in the first place. The pride of seeing the number rise was the same feeling that preceded every single purchase. Her savings have grown uninterrupted for 3 years now, not because her willpower suddenly improved, and not because the old discomfort disappeared. She still feels a flicker of something unfamiliar when she thinks about the number. If she thinks about it at all, she fixed it because she removed the moment where her old wiring got a chance to react to it. This is the part that matters most. And it's the part most advice gets wrong. You cannot white-knuckle your way past a pattern that isn't really about willpower to begin with. Trying harder to resist the next purchase doesn't address why the urge shows up right on schedule, right after your savings starts to feel real. It just delays the same cycle by a few more weeks, while adding a new layer of guilt and self-criticism on top of it, which, ironically, often makes the underlying discomfort worse, not better. The purchases were never really about the television or the trip or the laptop. Objects were never really the point. They were about restoring a familiar feeling, the feeling of not having too much, because too much never felt safe to begin with. It's the financial equivalent of returning to a familiar, even uncomfortable emotional temperature, simply because it's the temperature your system knows how to operate in. Once you can actually see that clearly, the purchases stop looking like random impulses or evidence that you're bad with money, and start looking like a very consistent, very understandable response to an old, outdated threat that your body hasn't gotten the memo is over. That reframe alone, from "I have no self-control" to "I have an old alarm system doing exactly what it was built to do," changes what kind of solution actually makes sense. Here's what actually interrupts this, and it has almost nothing to do with willpower. Don't watch the number. Set up an automatic transfer the day you get paid, into an account that isn't easily visible, a separate bank, ideally with no linked debit card, no app notification pinging your phone every time it grows. Let the number build somewhere you're not checking daily. You cannot sabotage what you're not staring at, because the trigger was never the money itself. It was the visible proof of the money. If you want a second layer, tell exactly one person about the account, not for accountability in the shaming sense, not so someone can police your spending, but simply so the growing number isn't a private secret only you're carrying. Often part of what makes savings feel so unfamiliar and threatening is that it exists in total isolation known only to you, with no outside witness to make it feel real and legitimate. A third layer, if the first two aren't quite enough, name the pattern out loud, the way Priya's friend named it for her. Something as simple as recognizing, "I tend to spend right after I feel proud of my savings," Yawning said to yourself, or to someone else, often reduces the automatic quality of the behavior. It's much harder for an unconscious pattern to keep running smoothly once you've actually looked directly at it. You don't have a spending problem, even though it's probably felt like one for a long time. You have an old, outdated alarm system that still thinks financial security is dangerous. Because once, a long time ago, in a very different set of circumstances, it genuinely was. That alarm was right for a while. It kept you cautious in a situation that called for caution. It just isn't right anymore. And it's not going to stop firing simply because you tell it to, or because you understand the psychology behind it, or because you white-knuckle your way through one more purchase you managed to resist. You have to build around it instead. Not fight it directly. Just make sure it doesn't have a clear view of what it's reacting to. The next time your savings crosses a number that makes you a little uncomfortable, a little too solid, a little too real, a little unfamiliar in a way you can't quite name, that discomfort isn't a warning. It's not your gut telling you something's wrong. It's just an old signal, sounding an alarm for a threat that isn't there anymore, finally being given the chance to be proven wrong.